welcome to our final session of the day on evolving structures for governance and accountability. We've been talking a lot about accountability gaps in the tech sector, but that's not to imply that these challenges are taking place in a vacuum. One of the most interesting developments or responses to this dynamic has been the emergence of new governance structures, particularly multi-stakeholder governance structures, which often assume a kind of hybrid, a co-regulatory posture where the roles of governments, private sector entities, civil society, and the public at large occupy varying and often evolving positions as these models continue to develop. So that's going to be the theme of our topic of our final panel today. Once again, we have an incredible panel. Joran Marby is the CEO and president of ICANN, the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, a position he has held since 2016. Prior to that, he had over 20 years experience as a senior executive in the internet and technology sector, including leading the Swedish Post and Telecom Authority, an independent regulatory body, as CEO and founder of AppGate, CEO for the advanced networks company Cygate Group, and as country manager for Cisco in Sweden. Wendy Seltzer is a strategy lead and counsel to the World Wide Web Consortium at MIT, improving the web's security, availability, and interoperability through standards. She also founded the Lumen Project, formerly Chilling Effects Clearinghouse, the web's pioneering transparency report to measure the impact of legal takedown demands online. She serves on the advisory board of Simply Secure and served on the founding boards of the Tor Project and the Open Source Hardware Association, and on the boards of ICANN and the World Wide Web Foundation. And David Kaye is a clinical professor of law at the University of California, Irvine, who currently serves as the independent chair of the board of directors for the Global Network Initiative, a multi-stakeholder platform which provides an evolving framework for responsible company decision-making in support of freedom of expression and privacy rights, and a safe space for shared learning and a forum for collective advocacy with governments and international institutions. He is also the former UN Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of the right to freedom of opinion and expression between 2014 and 2020. His 2019 book, Speech Police, The Global Struggle to Govern the Internet, explores the ways in which companies, governments, and activists struggle to define the rules for online expression. I want to start, and I'm Michael Karanikolas, the executive director of the UCLA Institute for Technology, Law, and Policy. I want to start by asking each of you to provide some initial thoughts. First, maybe just by briefly introducing the multi-stakeholder structure that you're sort of respectively a part of, as well as some initial thoughts on accountability across the tech space and the role that the organization that you're involved with plays in that context. Should we maybe start with Joran and then to Wendy and then to David?
I was actually thinking of asking you a question. Sorry, what is tech sector? When the question, and to give you a little bit of background on that, because we started a really philosophical discussion internally. Are ICANN part of a tech sector? You know, are we part of this? And the reason for that, and so for anyone who doesn't know what ICANN is, and I always suspect that no one knows what ICANN is that every time you go online, any device you're using, any kind of network, you actually hit about something that originates from ICANN. What we call them the identifiers. What we really do is to provide a common language for computers that so they can speak to each other. And that is the technical foundation that creates the internet. That's what we do. Nothing more, nothing less. That's what we do. And that is, so we wonder if we're even part of the tech sector. And ICANN is I think that we have a very particular multi-stakeholder model. And it's a fantastic one. And it's really to build a multi-stakeholder model that forms decisions and sets policies for what we do. I don't make the decisions. I'm sort of the executive arm of if the what we call the community is the parliament. We have them, the board is the government, and I'm the executive arm. It's really important that it's the parliament that sets the decision for us. And I think that we've been able to build this multi-stakeholder model specifically for what we do because there was no legislation around the world. We're now starting to see legislation sort of enter into our arena, but I think it's sort of we were there so early, but nobody cared about what we did in the beginning, and that's created the opportunity for multi-stakeholderism. But multi-stakeholder and our model also creates the need for an extreme accountability. And then the question comes, who are we accountable to? We are accountable for all the internet users of the world, of course, but we also are accountable back to our own community, to the point we have something that's called the empowered community, which is actually a way to move the whole board if the board doesn't behave according to the principles. So I want to start by so do you think we're actually part of the tech sector as a non-for-profit doing this? I'm not trying to be anyway, trying to distract you from your actual question, but you should know how much philosophical questions that actually raised with an ICANN.
Yeah, I absolutely understand that. And especially if you've been listening to the previous sessions, for the most part, they've been targeted towards generating accountability structures for entities like Facebook, for private sector interests. At the same time, the broader challenge that I'm hoping that this session is going to speak to is about developing new models of accountability and engagement to provide stakeholder feedback related to how the online space is governed. And so, I'm very aware of that disconnect, but I also think that as a multi-stakeholder organization, and also as one of the multi-stakeholder organizations, which is most commonly pointed to when people look for new models of governance, look for new models of public engagement and managing things outside of a traditional government and people context, ICANN is often at the forefront of that. And that was why I wanted to fit these ideas together.
Thank you. I mean, you're welcome into our philosophical discussions whenever you want. Sometimes the discussion is more important than the result. There's one thing I want to point out, and that is, when we talk about the internet, we talk about it for a specific thing. And in that sense, companies like Facebook, Google, and all the platform companies, we are not, anyway discarding how important they are, what they do, but they're not the internet. I mean, there's many times I talk to people and say that when you walk into platform companies, you actually leave the internet, you walk into someone else's computer, which is a little bit what the point you're making is, that when you're inside that environment, you're now controlled in a universe that is set by someone else. Because the point of the way we do things is that make sure that we don't have any control over what people actually do. We don't know where people is using their internet. We don't know what content they're providing. We don't know about, we don't know which kind of device you're using or which telco you're using for the access or anything else. The platform companies knows much more, and which I think leads to your question. So when we talk about the internet, we don't talk about the applications that is run on top of them. I think that, just to answer your question about I learned something working for ICANN as well, which is one of the things that makes, I think, ICANN's multi-stakeholder model working, with all its good and all its bad, because there's always people who's not going to like the consensus model we build, or don't like the outcomes that come of it, or that it takes time. Which I usually point to the UN, who took 25 years to come up with the international sea law that nobody follows. That's what we do, in a couple of years, because what we do is actually have an effect on all internet users around the world. But I think the processes and the bureaucracy of a transparent and accountable organization is not something that we have to. One of the things that it's not me, it's the ICANN community who actually build processes for accountability and transparency. I think that's been part of why the multi-stakeholder model in ICANN actually works. Boring, a lot of acronyms, a lot of that, but it creates the opportunity for anyone to walk into the room and actually have a say. And also knowing that on the other side of that, if you have enough people with you, there's a process that kicks off immediately that actually makes your voice, that happens on the other end. And especially when I speak to many who participate in different forums, when they go in and they're sort of used to, I go in and give my opinion and someone else make a decision. And we tell people, come in and you can actually be part of the solution. And that is also, I think, is a part of the multi-stakeholder model for ICANN. And I'm going to shut up now. We're going to say, I really enjoy working in the multi-stakeholder model because it's a really interesting phenomenon.
All right, I want to pass it over to Wendy to go next.
Thanks, Michael, and it's a good lead-in because the World Wide Web Consortium W3C sort of works at the application layer above the internet layer, where ICANN's names and identifiers work happens, and W3C is voluntary consensus standards body for the web, founded by Tim Berners-Lee shortly after he invented the web and wanted to give over governance to a body that would both and have a royalty-free patent policy. We want to get the core web technologies available without payment of patent royalties, and leading the web to its full potential is the organization's mission. Now that sounds big and powerful, but at the same time, voluntary and consensus are two key descriptors there. We have no enforcement powers and no standards police. It's you adopt web standards because you want to be able to interoperate with others who are using the same standards. And if you adopt HTML and CSS, then your website can be displayed by anyone with a browser that implements those standards. And that works when everyone wants to speak the same language, and it works when there's a shared technical problem, a good enough technical solution to it, and an interest in a joint solution. So that means that in the work that we do, we have to be looking for the win-win solutions where everyone who's participating, everyone whose input is necessary to make the standard succeed, has to see some benefit to adopting that standard. I mean, we can all look back at times when pieces of the web fragmented because the browser wars. One browser thought it was to their advantage to adopt some customizations and encourage building to their unique browser extensions, and that would set up a silo of the web, and it took time for people to come back to a sense that the value of write once, run everywhere is greater than the value that they could capture by building a unique corner of non-standard web. We see the same debates playing out again in web versus app, or in various native applications, or proprietary components versus the open web. We see it in the development of siloed components of the web, sign-on gated areas versus the open web. And some of those questions can be addressed by standards, and some of those questions are more questions of where do participants want to spend their time, where to, so when they identify places that they want common shared infrastructure, then W3C is a good place to be building that. And we try to create fora for good technical and consensus building, where we, in order to make something, bring something to W3C recommendation, which is what we call the end phase of the standardization process, it needs both consensus within the working group that's working to produce it, consensus support from the W3C membership, and wide and public review, so that it's not just those who have been working on the technology, but a broader public input with specific emphasis on what we call horizontal reviews, assuring that the recommendation looks at global internationalization considerations, accessibility challenges to people of all abilities and disabilities, security and privacy considerations. And so that is looking at how is the public interest served by the technology recommendations. And consensus doesn't mean unanimity. It doesn't mean that everybody thinks that every decision in the spec is correct, but everyone can live with it, and every objection that's been brought forward has at least gotten a reasoned response, because the legitimacy of the standard comes from people being able to understand and believe that it was a fair process that achieved that result.
All right, and I'd maybe go over to David next as well to introduce, maybe just to introduce the GNI as well as your own work in this space.
Sure, Michael, thank you. It's pretty cool to follow Wendy, in part because Wendy, you created Lumen, which I think is such an important and kind of visionary approach to transparency when it comes to content, and the efforts of different actors to take down content, and more people should know about it. Actually, it's such a fantastic tool. So I'll say a few words about the Global Network Initiative, and it's actually kind of in keeping with Lumen in many ways. So the Global Network Initiative is an organization. Again, it's multi-stakeholder. It doesn't involve governments, but it's multi-stakeholder in the fact that it involves a variety of constituencies: companies, so corporate, private sector constituencies, non-governmental organizations / civil society, investors, and academics. And each of those constituencies are represented on the board of GNI and are part of the membership of GNI. And GNI basically operates at two different levels. So the first level, which I think is the most important and foundational level, is that at the time that the GNI was established, which was happening just around the time that John Ruggie was investigating and creating through this vast process of consultation with all sorts of actors, the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. So at the foundation level of the GNI is something that actually sounds similar to what you might see in the UN Guiding Principles. In other words, it has two sets of principles on the freedom of expression and principles of privacy, that all of the actors in the GNI, particularly the private sector actors, commit to observing in the course of their activities. And so, that part of observation of, fundamental rights is very much in keeping with what ultimately developed in the UN Guiding Principles. And it's essential because it grounds all of the work that the GNI does in basic human rights principles, and basically articulate standards that companies are meant to follow. The second level, which is essential and actually makes the GNI different than other actors in the sort of tech, whatever tech is, space. And maybe I should pause just for a moment to say when I talk about the private sector, the kinds of actors that participate in the GNI include social media and search companies. So Facebook, YouTube / Google as a part of it. Wikimedia as a kind of unusual, maybe you don't think of as, your typical, private sector actor, but a nonprofit. And also telecommunications companies and others that are emerging as potential joiners who are observers within the GNI. In any event, GNI, in addition to creating a space for learning about different kinds of issues, particularly around government demands on the companies and on individuals in terms of the takedown of content and the limitation of access to information and so forth, in addition to kind of a learning process and a policy development process where the GNI will actually engage in providing advice and consultation related to either international development of policy, multilateral development, or regional development, such as in the European Commission and its Digital Services Act, or in national level development of regulation. The GNI will be engaged in those issues and provide guidance based on those principles that I mentioned. But perhaps the most unusual part of the GNI is its assessment process. Each of the company actors within the GNI agrees to and provides financial support for the independent assessment of their activities in relation to those fundamental principles of privacy and freedom of expression. And that kind of assessment process is a kind of governing structure in a way. Now, it's not a replacement for government regulation. And the GNI is not meant to be a replacement or a substitute for that. But as we know in this space, particularly in the space around content, there isn't a whole lot of government regulation, certainly not a lot of transparency regulation. And so GNI kind of steps into that role and creates space for this kind of opportunity for conversation, for transparency among the different constituencies that I outlined. And in that sense, it's created real room for both understanding on the academic and civil society and investor front with respect to what company actors are doing, what they're facing from governments, and also for those other constituencies, particularly civil society, to engage directly with the companies and highlight the concerns that they have. So that's kind of a high altitude overview of the GNI. I think that it creates a kind of model that governments, as they're thinking about regulation, might think about essentially taking on board and modeling in their own thinking about regulation. But it's one existing format and forum for that kind of interaction among those different actors.
Yeah, thanks. I want to pivot. So I think that's a great sort of initial framing of this issue, as we've seen a lot of these important issues being raised, including interactions with governments, including transparency. I want to start by digging a little bit more deeply into this question of accountability, and specifically around legitimacy of process and public perception of legitimacy around outcomes. Because I know the different mechanisms that you've worked with will engage that challenge with different ways, and will have different needs in terms of the degree of the type of confidence that you need to have in your outcomes. But I think one thing that these three different mechanisms share as non-governmental organizations, as relatively novel new organizations, is in this challenge of getting people to believe in what you're doing and getting people to accept and understand and a perception of legitimacy around it. So I would be interested to hear from all three of you the way that you approach that challenge and the what you think about that and the obstacles that are there and how those are overcome. Maybe again in the same order, starting with Joran.
Start with, I have to think about this question. Reverse the order.
I'll reverse the order. David, do you want to go first?
Sure. I think there's always an issue of, if I could step back, in terms of building credibility, building a kind of public presence, and building space for interaction between a particular multi-stakeholder initiative and those outside of the initiative who need to understand what's happening inside, and also for regulators and legislators who are trying to understand what's happening and what develops within that process. I mean, I think that the GNI and other initiatives do this as well. I think there's a real effort to convert the learning that we achieve within the GNI into really usable frameworks outside of the GNI. I mean, but that's I think a real effort that we all have to be making within it. So, our learning often, just to give an example, in the context of an emerging threat or in a dangerous environment for technology companies. And by that, I mean, where certain technology companies are involved in environments where perhaps their employees on the ground are under threat, perhaps their users are subject to to criminal investigation or criminal procedure of some sort. In those kinds of environments, sometimes it's really important for the companies, for the sector more generally, to learn from civil society in a kind of confidential, closed environment as to what they're seeing, and to get advice from them as to how they should interact with the government in that kind of context. And the GNI has regularly provided that kind of space under, essentially like a Chatham House rules kind of environment, where the companies can learn, well, what are the steps that they can take that are consistent with, the foundational principles of freedom of expression and privacy, and also do it in a way that is responsive to what civil society is seeing on the ground. And oftentimes those conversations are not accessible outside, for good reason, right? Because if they're open, it may be harder for different actors to, particularly on the company side, but certainly for the civil society side, to engage in an open way, about the kind of concerns that they have. And so, I'm not sure if I'm really answering your question, but it sort of raises for me that kind of issue of how do you extend that credibility of, the internal process that you've been developing within your multi-stakeholder initiative? How do you extend it so that it has some visibility outside of that tent? And that's something that, to be sure, we struggle with, but at least creating that space for answering the questions consistent with human rights standards seems to me to be kind of a core value that certain kinds of multi-stakeholder initiatives can provide.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the understanding your role and developing an organizational and decision-making structure, an actionable structure, which suits that role, is critical to that. And I think that there are different models that are going to be there, partly because there are different institutional needs among the different folks that we have here. Wendy,
can I just, Michael, before we move on, I just want to be clear that any company in the tech sector, however we define it, faces different problems in different kinds of environments. And so, I mean, that's obvious, of course, but the kinds of companies that operate both at scale, or they operate, like a telco, a telecommunications company operating, with actual people on the ground in dangerous environments, they face different kinds of problems and different kinds of concerns. And those are different from the kinds of concerns that might arise when we think about regulation in, generally speaking, in democratic / rule of law respecting environments. And one thing that I think multi-stakeholder initiatives can provide is space for kind of comparing the different ways in which there's spillover from, the dangerous environments, the environments of threat to freedom of expression and privacy, by authoritarian governments, and sometimes how that spills over into, sometimes rhetorically, sometimes, in concrete ways, into the way in which democratic or rule of law governed societies tend to think about the same kinds of issues around content and around rights. So I think, it's just important to be thinking about the different spaces and the different kinds of threats that companies and civil society face, and that companies might also contribute to.
Yeah, well, I think the question about the role of governments and differentiations between governments with different positions on these issues is absolutely something to dig into. But I want to go back to Wendy and to Wendy first, and to Joran on the first question.
Yeah, so legitimacy in web standards and in a lot of the voluntary consensus standards process, comes in part from process. You wander into a standards meeting and you'll hear an awful lot of process. Have we gone through the right reviews? Have we called for input? Have we reached consensus in the room? W3C doesn't use the IATF hums, but we use similar calls for consensus. And has everyone who had a concern been addressed to, if not to their satisfaction, at least to what others can see as a full airing of the viewpoints? So even as our process now is conducted largely in GitHub issue threads and online discussions, you can, if you want to, walk through how were those decisions made and how were the various viewpoints taken into account. And if people can't come to agreement, we have places where we can't find consensus for a long time, and then it's a matter of, do people recognize that coming to some agreement is better than holding out for their viewpoint at the risk of not being able to interoperate, at the risk of not having a standard for whether it's use of GPU to provide computation for the web, or web authentication to provide a standard for strong cryptographic authentication. In each one of those, there are sort of fiercely held interests that often recognize it's better that we interoperate and grow the opportunity for all, even if we haven't had every one of our positions accepted. And some of the discussions can get highly technical, and so our process also aims to make it legible to the outside, to help those who aren't engaged in the day-to-day discussions see that they were fairly reached, and see that the range of viewpoints were considered. And so that the checkpoints in the process for wide and public review get documentation of the consideration that was made, and try to show to the broader public the ways that the discussion led to the choices that were made. And then ultimately the participants choose whether to use and adopt these standards. And there are certainly efforts in standards that have proceeded all the way to the end and then failed in the marketplace because they didn't end up serving the needs of the users and the ecosystem, and that too is a check on the institution and its processes. Are we listening to all of the voices in the broader community and meeting their needs?
So I imagine a lot of the same ideas are going to be true if we talk about ICANN as well, where the legitimacy comes out of the process. But it also, I think, goes beyond that. Yeah.
Both yes and no. I would say that one of the things I really enjoyed by going last year is, of course, that I can listen to other sports people so I can formulate But it's one of the things like this. Your questions are really good because it shows one thing. We often use words like multi-stakeholderism as a generic description of something. And there are a lot of ways, many things that are in common in the way we set up the multi-stakeholderism in our organization. But there are also some differences. And I think that's important. That's an important takeaway for me, that a multi-stakeholderism is sort of targeted for an end result. And because if you actually do different things, you can't use the same, and you shouldn't. That is, by the way, quite fun sometimes when we meet in the ecosystems and we try to figure out how the decision-making process actually works in another acronym related, because we all love acronyms. We have that in common. We all love acronyms. So I feel that ICANN has its own sort of history, and you know, at the first week, the really thing that makes, I think, ICANN not unique, because everybody here is unique, it gives us one of the accountability, is the fact that we actually perform a technical service to the world. Through IANA, through DNSSEC and some other acronyms we're using, we actually do perform something. We update the root service. The root service through the resolvers are actually the ones you actually meet every time. So that, I think, is the underlying reasons why ICANN, who was formed to run the IANA, what is it now, 22, 23 years ago, is one of the reasons. The other reason, I think, is also, which is a little bit more fun, but you know, it's a unique thing, is that 2016, the US government relinquished its last contract or control over ICANN. Technically, we didn't renew a contract. We call that a transition. It was a technical matter in that sense, but anyone who followed that particular part of the ICANN history knew it was interesting. And actually, what was interesting there, that 165 countries around the world, I can't remember how many members we have in the GAC at the time, actually stood up and said, yes, it's fine. We're going to give this to the multi-stakeholder model and ICANN to proceed with. They put in there was a lot of, and the US government was very strong in this, also put in a lot of mechanical transparency and accountability measures. Some of them we're still working on because it's not easy to change them. But I also think that creates a little bit of it. The last thing I think is also which is probably the most important thing of all of this, is the fact that we are blessed with a large portion of very engaged people from all different parts of life from around the world engaging in ICANN. I mean, we just had a meeting last week. I think we had 1,600 people from 150 countries around, which actually is a low number. And time zones is very hard because when we move the time zones around the world, it was easy for me this time. I could actually work day. The last time we had the meeting was supposed to have a meeting in Hague, I worked nights. So time zone is an issue in what we do. But I think that the community has over time been very, very good of taking decisions, having discussions, and that I think creates a strength. We also do one more thing, which is unusual, and that's we actually set rules and we enforce them, which is a different from many other organizations, is that when the ICANN community, when in its policy-making process, makes rules, we put them into contracts, and then we actually follow up. And that also creates a sort of an accountability to it, that you can see a sort of direct effect on what the community has decided upon in a contractual arrangement that we have with what we call contracted parties. And that is, I think, is one of those things, because it gives this direct thing. I think we had a stress test for the last couple of years, and I think I'm very pleased how we got it. And that was in relationship to GDPR. The GDPR had an effect and I'm not making any, I don't have any view on GDPR as a legislation itself, but it did have an effect on some of the things we did. And it was hard for this is really the first time where the community actually have to sit down to make a policy under the interpretation of a very new law. And a law that is, and I have to admit, that is not always easy to understand what effects it has. At the same time as the legislators didn't like that we actually implemented a law they actually came up with, which has been interesting, but that's actually the truth. So, and I think that we actually came out right, because we despite all the discussions and some of the miscontent, we were able to do something. We were able to implement the legislation for the WHOIS system very early on. We got the notification from the Data Protection Board that we're doing things right. But it was a stress test, and I think that stress test will continue, because what we're seeing now is, of course, more legal proposals or legislative proposals around the world will have an effect on ICANN's ability to make policies, and we have to learn how to take them into account. We also have to learn how to engage with governments to tell them that, yeah, it might be a good idea, but you're going to break the internet if you do this. And I'm not even joking. We have seen legislative proposals around the world that under the umbrella of privacy that actually disconnects users from the internet. And when you speak to the legislators, they say, oh, that was not our intention. So I think that the multi-stakeholder model in ICANN has to continue to evolve how we do it. One of the good things is actually that we have the GAC, which is the Government Advisory Committee inside ICANN, because we can often have this conversations with the GAC about things like this. And it creates also, I think, it creates so governments will know what we're doing. And as long as we know what we're doing, it takes away a little bit of the mystery. But heart of it all, and I have to come back to that, is the fantastic engagement we have from ICANN community members that continues to engage, shout, argue, have tedious discussion about commas, but and take time to do it. But when they actually come up with something, a lot of things changes around the world. So, and I want to go back to what Wendy said about processes. Processes are extremely important, which you might think it's a multi-stakeholder model, everybody can come in. But because to make sure that everybody's voices are heard, to create this democratic experiment, you have to be transparent, and you have to make sure that it's not done in small rooms and dark corners. It has to be completely open, and people should be able to follow our sometimes really extremely dwindling processes to at least know where we are in the decision-making process. So unfortunately, or funny enough, bureaucracy is an essential part of a multi-stakeholder model, which it took me a year or so to understand that. And if anyone on this call would like to have a little bit of insight of that, we have on our web a description of all the processes that exist within ICANN up to the decision point. And if you don't have anything to do for like 4 weeks or something, or you don't have anything better in life, just have a look at it. That is the multi-stakeholder model in a graphical form.
I think my favorite illustration of ICANN's of the complexity of ICANN's process is the long list of acronyms that is also on the website, which runs to many pages. And I think
I tried, Michael, just as you know, I tried to change that, and my team has not told me I'm not allowed to name things after I named the when we engaged with the European Commission the first time. The first project was Calzone, and the second one was Strawberry. We also had Blueberry, Gutsy Star, Blueberry. I mean, we had them all, but now my staff have said, let's go back to acronyms.
If I'm ever talking about ICANN to a non-ICANN audience, I try to keep like the equivalent of a swear jar in front of me, and I make a commitment that every time I use an acronym, I'll put $1 in, and that tends to help to correct that behavior. But I think that the question about interacting with governments and government regulation is a good one. I think that obviously, ICANN has a particular space there where you have governments as stakeholders, and you have them directly at the table. But I think that all three organizations, as illustrated by David's last comment, need to think about how they interact with government policy. And more broadly, as we talk about the emergence of multi-stakeholder governance organizations, the natural comparison is that they're occupying spaces that governments are not, or as a complement to government decision-making in this space, or in order to push back against certain government decision-making in this space. I wonder if any of you want to comment on how you see the role of your own structures vis-a-vis those of governments, particularly given the emergence of these as parallel processes for discussion, consultation, accountability, decision-making, and the like. And I don't want to call on anyone on this one, but so I'll put that one open to anyone that wants to respond.
I was unpolite last time, so I can start. So of course in ICANN, we have a charter agreed by the community how to interact with the governments. And that's important. It's a part of the transparency. with that said, we are working, and actually during the last week's ICANN meeting, we had a lot of discussion with the community, how to better interact with the community so we can be more transparent. That's an initiative that actually comes from us, because there are so many legislative proposals and so much politics in this, and we want the ICANN community to know about it. But I'm going back to what we said. I mean, we are a technical organization, and ICANN doesn't take a side in, for instance, the purpose of a GDPR and AS2 proposals on the Hill, or in China or in anywhere else. We don't do that. We only go in there under the technical mandate, just to tell that this will create a technical problem for the. I mean, for right now, for instance, the NIS2's proposal about regulating the root servers, a system that has been working flawlessly for 35 years with no downtime. We don't think that's a good idea. So things like that we do engage in, but it's a balance. When the GAC, who has, I think now, and I'm actually trying to figure that out, 170 plus members, that yes, they have a place at the table. They give advice. We have to follow them on a formal way. We have interaction. I think one of the important things is that, and we actually invite, if there is a problem, are also our colleagues in the ecosystem. So the numbers community, or if our friends in the web community would like to interact with governance, we try to give them a side as well. So it's a resource not only for ICANN issues, it also should be a resource for the whole ecosystem, because we're the only one who has it. But also gives an opportunity to educate governments around the world about how the internet actually works. Because it turns out that many people don't know how the internet actually works. They don't know how IANA works, and I don't understand why not everybody understands that. IP addressing, DNS, and all of those things. I think it should be part of the school. I mean, even going back to, I'm now going off a little bit, but like the discussion about platforms versus the internet. It's the diversity that the internet actually gives versus the sort of platformization of the internet is one of the things we discuss a lot. What does it make to the internet itself if people go online and just go into a platform versus the diversity that the internet actually as itself can provide, where you can hit anyone you want who has an internet access around the world with no intermediates. That's sort of, there are things that we are talking about, but I'm digressing now. Thank you. I hope there was an answer to your question there somewhere.
And do either of the rest of you want to talk a little bit about your interactions with governments or your role vis-a-vis those of governments in the online space?
I think there are a few different ways that the governments interact in the web standards. Sometimes they are government agencies are participants in the processes, and so open government data uses and participates in the development of data interchange standards, and as another of the stakeholders in that development. Other times there's a complementary role that government legislation or regulation might refer to standards, and they might refer to specific standards, as is particularly the case with a lot of accessibility regulations, both in the United States and Europe, refers to compliance with the W3C content accessibility guidelines as a measure of, are you making your web content accessible to people with disabilities? And so that standard developed by participants and through the W3C process then gets incorporated by reference in regulation or legislation, and our goal in doing the standards work is to build standards that are useful and fit for purpose, and sometimes the purpose is government reference, and sometimes the government can be a source of pressure to get people around the table to work together. sometimes, and I think, we see that in the case of privacy standards. Sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't work to. So folks may or may not be familiar with the work around do not track several years ago, when there was great pressure to build a technical signal by which customers, end users, could indicate whether they wanted to be tracked online or not. Governments were interested in having that signal available, but not necessarily in the details of how it would be conveyed. The process spent a lot of time, found it pretty easy to say what a signal would look like in a technical header, but then faltered on agreement on what it should mean when that header was set, what behavior would be required on the other side if you received a do not track header. But of course, the privacy problem doesn't, privacy challenges don't go away. And so now we have different efforts underway to see, are there other pieces of communication that the webs could facilitate that give a more nuanced communication of privacy preferences, and that give hooks for enforcement without us trying to define the regulatory parameters, or without having governments trying to rewrite what a web browser does. So that sort of complement, if we can provide the technical infrastructure by which government can interact with standards, I think that's valuable.
David, did you want to chime in, or I can also go on to the next?
Well, yeah, I mean, I'd just say that, there's just real variation. It's impossible to say that there's a kind of one size fits all approach to interacting with governments, with government demands, with engaging with them in all sorts of ways. I mean, in part that's because, the different parts of the sector engage with governments individually in very different ways. If you're a telecommunications company, you're engaged directly with the government in your licensing, your contracting, your infrastructure, your hiring of staff, and so forth. And that's very different from the kind of interaction, that a social media company based in Menlo Park or San Bruno is going to have with governments thousands of miles away. And so, I mean, that interaction and just varies across tech. It actually goes back to Jorn's initial question, which is, when we talk about the tech sector, what are we actually talking about? And so I think we do need to just think a little bit differently about those kinds of interactions. The other thing that I think is important to keep in mind is that, governments, I mean, obviously not all governments, but governments have been, particularly in spaces where there isn't a lot of existing regulation, they've really tried to, in a certain way, strong arm companies, and particularly to strong arm them as a group in different kinds of settings. And one example is the European Commission's effort to create a kind of code of conduct around hate speech several years ago. I mean, Germany tried the same thing, and those kinds of initiatives, they have a certain wisdom to them, but they also have a certain kind of pressure that's extra regulatory, that is contrary to norms of transparency and openness and public debate and public participation. And we just have to be alive to those different kinds of pressures that often, are imposed upon, different multi-stakeholder initiatives.
Yeah, sorry, Joran, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I just want to, I was thinking about this. We are also well aware, governments are different around the world, and the interactions with different governments are different. And we also know that there are governments who doesn't like the internet model, who would like to have a more increased control of what happens to the internet. Who should have internet, who should be able to be on the internet, what you can post on the internet, both on applications, on the application layer, just being very old. I haven't said the OSI model in a very long time. I see at least Wendy smiling. Thank you. And that, it's interesting for us as well, because these countries also come to the ICANN meetings with government representatives. Right now, for instance, to give a concrete example, I can give you a couple of concrete examples, and one of them is that we just, together with cooperation with several governments around the world, we were able to fight off a proposal that the UN should declare the DNS as a critical infrastructure. That, why would that be a problem? Because legally, you actually give a competence to the UN system that the DNS is now under them. It's a legal thing, which means that you open up the opportunity for governments actually engaging formally inside the UN. The UN is an agreement where you can only talk about the things that countries has agreed upon you can talk about. You can't talk about everything. And if the internet would itself be under there, we have just moved it. Right now, there is a fight for who's going to be the next Secretary General of the ITU, which is the sort of the telecom arm of the UN. Thanks to them, we have things like mobile phones. Because they, help us to make spectrum doesn't end over, radio wave doesn't end at countries, so countries has to agree upon how to use radio waves, and that's mobile, and that has been the role of ITU for a long time to make those arrangements. And the Russian candidate, Rashid, who, for transparency, an old friend of mine, his whole platform is about that you take over ICANN, what Wendy's doing, what the RERs are doing, what the ITF, all those acronyms in one. Should be taken over, and also the country code operators should be taken over under the umbrella of the UN and the ITU. That's their platform, and they're not hiding it. The other one is actually a candidate from the US, a good friend of mine called, which is named Doreen, who has a traditional platform believing that the internet should be free and open for everybody. We will have many fights over the next couple of years. When it comes to this, just to preserve the open internet as itself, the interoperable internet. And you have business interests as well. You have governments who works with teleoperators and other ones who are trying to, through standardization forums, take away the open internet, interoperable internet. For anyone who's listening to this who's not engaged in ICANN, you should, or in any of those areas, because internet is not done, and you can't. Internet is like the democracy. If you don't make sure it continues to work, it's going to stop working. And we are waiting for also the next generation to come into this. It's not done, and it needs to be preserved. So sorry for the sales things as well.
No, I absolutely very much agree with the idea of that it's important to participate, and I can urge everybody to do that. It's funny, throughout both today's discussions and the discussions prior to this week, we've heard a lot about bad legislative proposals. I find it's useful to separate those into the legislative proposals that are bad because they're malevolent, if you want to think about it that way, and it's a direct frontal attack on online speech. But I think as somebody pointed out earlier, there's also a huge category of them that are just incompetently structured by governments that don't understand the impacts of what they're doing and how that's actually going to impact how speech information, how it flows on the internet. And that there's, I think that maybe the last proposal that you mentioned seems like a combination of the two, and maybe it's driven by a combination of factors. But Wendy, did you have something to say?
Yeah, and I wanted to follow up on the Joran's point about the ways that governments can inadvertently interfere. That the World Wide Web depends on being, accessible in the same way, across borders, and so even the non-malevolent regulations that set different rules for web and internet in different jurisdictions make it more difficult to build a web application that's global, that connects people across borders. And so while we are not advocating for or against any specific government action, we are advocating that governments take into account the goals and values of a World Wide Web and of free and open communication.
Great.
I can give you, if you want to, I can give you a fun example, but maybe David should speak first. So so there's two things that is lined here. One of them, it's going to be a European one because it's sort of fun. So a couple of years ago, the European Court of Justice, in a case that happens about data retention, and anyone who goes in to check that will find my name because I was the one I was a regulator in Europe who didn't appreciate the Data Retention Act in Europe. So through me, it ended up in the Court of Justice and the whole thing disappeared. But in that, they actually made a notion that said that IP addresses can be seen as private and personal data. So here came GDPR. And of course, we use IP addresses also for the distribution of the actual internet. That's what you're using. And we use that also particularly to make sure that we set up the session with a machine, which means that we actually saw a proposal saying that we should take that into account, distributing that the end user actually have to agree upon that the IP address uses. Of course, technically, we can't connect to even ask the question beforehand. You actually have to connect to the internet to be able to engage on the internet. And that is exactly what you talked about, Michael. That is an unintended consequences of this time an interpretation of a law, that you have to say yes to something that is deemed to be private before you actually connect to the internet so you can ask the question. Our answer was very interesting. I think you solved the privacy issue on the internet because you just killed it. I mean,
so
that's what we do for a living.
Yeah. So I want to encourage folks in the audience, if you have any questions, to put them into the chat. I do want to ask all three of you about transparency because that's something that's, I think, come up a lot. I know that it certainly ties into the previous discussions that we've had around the challenges around developing legitimacy for these governance structures, that the process is important to that, and transparency has to be part. You have to show people what you're doing. You have to give people an opportunity to engage. Certainly, my own engagement around at ICANN, I think I've been something of a pest around transparency questions. But there is a legitimate trade-off, I think, between transparency and efficiency, or ability to move processes forward, or ability to provide effective venues for conversation. I think David, to a certain extent, touched on this earlier, of ways to navigate that tension. I wanted to open it up to any thoughts about that trade-off, about how transparency is managed in these processes, and about how about what transparency means in the context of multi-stakeholder governance structures.
I mean, I'll say something about this. I mean, the first thing I would say is it's really not possible to talk about transparency as a thing that means the same thing across different processes, different industries, different organizations. It's just it means different things, right? And so, there's the question, for example, if we want to think about social media companies, that operate at massive scale, what's the transparency that is most important in that context, but important for understanding how they operate and understanding the impact that they have on public institutions. I mean, there's just real variety. So one kind of transparency is transparency to research. The Facebook papers that have been dominant in the mainstream press over the last month or so, have highlighted, I think, just how poor a job the company has done in terms of being transparent to research, particularly when you think about a platform that has such a massive impact on, on social life, on public institutions, and so forth. So one kind of transparency is transparency to research, right? That's very different from the kind of transparency that might go, even if we're still talking about, about social media. Again, just using it as an example, transparency around government demands that are made on different social media actors, demands to take down content, demands to change their rules, and so forth. And there's also very limited kind of transparency. So I think if we think about transparency, we do need to think about what is the transparency that is necessary in order to achieve particular public policy goals in each of those different areas that we're talking about. But to talk about transparency as just a thing, that applies in the same way, isn't really possible to do.
Yeah, I think the other lesson to me from the Facebook papers is that this information in some way tends to find its way out into the public domain one way or the other. That to me has been a great argument in favor of formalizing processes to deliver information and to structure it, because there's if you're operating in a space where there's an enormous public interest around what you're doing, then information tends to find a way to get out there one way or the other. Wendy or Jörn, I'm not sure if either of you wanted to follow up.
If there's anything, I think there's a couple of things I want to add to this, and transparency is a holy grail in the journey, more than an absolute. You can't, as I think David was saying, it's really hard to measure it. I mean, I'm gonna in the chat, I'm actually going to post a link. So behind of everything we do, there is when we talk about IANA, there is something we call I'm nerdy, I know that, the root cell. That is actually the thing that controls, that's the thing that controls the whole DNS system. And there's there. It's completely open. And you can actually download the actual technical file. Of course, that's uninteresting for most people. Nerds like me love it, but most people don't care. So the other part is that you need to be able to know. I think we often talk about transparency as like everything should be accessible. I think many of us have to do a better job, also make it understandable for people. You mentioned acronyms. I mean, we have to train people when we hire them in acronyms. We use a very technical lingo. That's not a context to it. So in ICANN, you can be very much, you can dive into many conversations. We give a space for some of the actual conversations so people freely can talk, so they don't feel hindered. So we don't record every sessions, we don't do that. But the decision on how we get there is always very transparent. I think we need to be better actually to be also put a narrative around without taking away that you can get access to data. One of the things we do is that we used to call it the Open Data Initiative, and then I stole that acronym for another thing, so I can't remember what it is. But basically, what we're trying to do is take all the data we have, regardless of what it is, and put it in under an API, so everybody can get access to the data and actually dwell into data as well, because we have loads of data. The continuous discussion about what transparency for organizations like ICANN creates accountability, and We are right now realizing that we have to do better. We are spending $8 to $10 million actually to rebuild our whole system when it comes to access to information. We call it ITI, another acronym, which I don't remember.
Information Transparency Initiative.
Yes, I actually think I came up with that one, to be honest. So it's easier to connect information between each other, and then it's an ambition, but it has to be there.
Yeah, I think you're right to connect up, transparency and understandability, and if we're keeping things at a level that bars a lot of people from participating in the process or understanding the process, we're not doing as well as we could to explain our decisions and to invite broad participation. So we also have worked to incorporate explainers and documentation into the process so that participants can join and follow the discussion, and encouraging the technical participants to explain themselves clearly helps us all to do better in the decision-making process. Yeah.
I think that's exactly, I mean, one example of that is also, these public calls for algorithmic transparency, and, understanding, when we talk about like, what does it mean to have an algorithm that's transparent? I mean, there's several layers of that, right? I mean, there's the data that informs the algorithm. There's the choices that might be made, whether we're talking about the private or the public sector. I mean, there's all sorts of elements, and at the heart of it, I think, is exactly what Wendy's describing or identifying, which is, and what Joran was as well, which is, it's not enough just to say, here it is. That doesn't really advance public debate or the potential for smart regulatory frameworks. It also has to be explained. I mean, that's true of research as well. Some research, including the papers in the Facebook cache that's been released, some of those papers are really based on certain kinds of methodologies around social science research, and they require a kind of translation by experts so that they actually have meaning in the public space and have meaning for regulators and for legislators. So I think that, it's absolutely right to think about this as translatability in addition to just sort of like peeling back a curtain.
So there's two questions for Thomas from Thomas Schreins in the chat, which also happened to be on my list, and I think he addresses them to Joran, but I think they're good for all of you. One is around power imbalances within multi-stakeholder institutions, and I think that this is probably something that each of you has different ways to try and grapple with. You can put everybody around the same table, you can give everyone the same chance to comment, but there's always going to be gaps. There's going to be gaps between representatives from the rich world and the poor world. There's going to be gaps within those different countries between people that have the resources to engage on a voluntary basis and those that don't. There's going to be gaps between industry representatives that can afford to send lots of people to go and engage in these processes, and community or civil society-based organizations that don't. How do each of your organization think about these imbalances, and how do you try and create an avenue for engagement that tries to mitigate those?
Who should start? You have to point at someone, Michael. You're the boss here.
I don't want to put everybody on the spot, but please go ahead.
Okay, I didn't volunteer, by the way, but the questions were for me. I was going to answer the first one. So it's a good question. It's accountable. We are accountable formally to the ICANN community, but we want to make sure that the ICANN community have representatives from different parts of the world. So the ICANN community is actually designed in such a way that we have academia, we have civil society, we have businesses, we have telcos, we have governments, and all of them coming into under different acronyms. You know, we love acronyms. It's designed in such a way, and one of them for end users, we do have something called the at-large structure, which has structures around the world. And the meaning there is to make sure that ordinary users, if you excuse my sentence, can actually walk in and have an opinion about that as well. The at-large is one of our biggest structures. So that's one part of them. To answer the other question is that we have, and this is something that, it didn't come out of nothing. It was a lot of discussions how to structure the decision-making process in ICANN in such a way that it actually benefits the consensus model. And I'm going to, so ICANN, as I said, is two arms. One of this, we produce the technical capabilities for internet to exist through the IANA functions. We don't set policies for all of that. Numbers are distributed for others than us, our friends in the what we call the RER community, who actually distributes the IP addresses, and there are a couple of them around the world. You have ITF, who is a standard organization. So despite that we have the technical part of it, we don't set the policies for that within ICANN, and it's by design. We don't run the root servers that's around the world. We have one of them, but there are many independent root servers. So what I'm trying to say, we built into the system, and it's a beautiful design to make sure you have checks and balances in the actual technical distribution and the policy setting. So that's one part of it. Inside, we have many different consensus models, and it's set up. So give you an example, the one who sets policies for new top-level domains, we call it GNSO. The only thing they can do is to set that, and that is separated into different interest groups. You have civil society with their own, you have intellectual property with their own, you have business constituencies with their own, you have the ISPs with their own, you have the registrars and the registries, which are the contributing parties in our world, et cetera, who sits in there, and they actually make the policies. Around that, we have what we call advisory committees. For instance, you have one who works with technology and security. ESAC, we have the GAC, who's an advisory committee as well, who have governments. You have at large, who all have one thing. They can give advice to the board that the board has to take into account. So there's nothing works beautifully. I mean, Winston Churchill, I think, and I'm paraphrasing, you all heard this, once said that democracy is the world's way ever to run a country. The problem is that all the other varieties are even worse. And that is the ICANN multi-stakeholder model. It's and we do spend a lot of time thinking about what you just said. And we know that strong people with strong voices will always have, a strong voice in this one. But the system is actually built and designed by the community to at least give an answer to questions we put into it. And here's the catch. I, as the ICANN CEO, can't formulate that question. I can't tell the community what to do. I can't even formulate the problem. It has to come out of the community structure. Is it perfect? No, but I think we have done a fairly good job to making it, and it's a constant involvement all the time.
Wendy or David?
We have similar community structures at W3C. Formally in the process, every member, large or small, has equal voice. Now, as the question alludes to, practically, there are different numbers of participants and different degrees of engagement, but every comment made gets the same hearing, and every input needs to be considered, and we try through processes like the horizontal reviews to reach out for input from parts of the community where we are concerned about making sure minority voices and languages are represented in the internationalization work, making sure that communities of people with disabilities are participating in the accessibility work and giving input as we review specifications for are they meeting those needs. And we are trying to reach out to provide the widest input in those assessments of are the specs being developed meeting the needs of the one web and the global web. We have our technical architecture group. We've recently published findings on ethical web principles, also trying to bring values into the conversation, that it's not just about what the corporate interests in the discussion might want, but making sure that those are accounting for societal interests and our interests as people and citizens. So it's our process too is constantly evolving under community discussion, and as we get inputs for how to open up further, we try to take those into account as well.
So I want to just answer Thomas's question. His sort of second round of question, I think, gets at the heart of a problem that I think G&I certainly tried to address. And so he says, what do you do when your commercial group, your private sector group might be more powerful than the non-commercial stakeholder groups? So so this is where I think institutional design is really quite important. And so, you need to think about things like, voting power and participation on your decision-making boards, right? So you create, multi-stakeholder initiatives. They're not this kind of airy-fairy thing out there, right? Where they just you're getting a lot of people together in a room and it's kumbaya. You actually have to have a decision-making structure that's built into them that allows for voice from the different actors, and that allows for the decisions. It really goes back to the legitimacy question, that allows for everybody within that organization to come out of decisions and out of those decision-making processes with a sense of the legitimacy of the outcome. Doesn't mean that everybody agrees with every outcome, but there's an agreement that it was conducted fairly. It was conducted in a way that no particular party had power that was inconsistent with the nature of the effort overall. And so I think that when you think about those things, you start to get into very specific questions of, how many members of each constituency do you have in your decision-making bodies? How do you come to decisions? Is your decision-making model a consensus one, or is it a, is it a majority vote one? All of those different kinds of decisions, we could go on and on, talk about them. All of those go into whether, whether you get the appropriate balance in a multi-stakeholder initiative. It doesn't always work. And I think that one of the risks of any, maybe it's not a risk, but one of the, and Joran was mentioning this before, one of the threats to any multi-stakeholder initiative, certainly one that's actually addressing real problems, is that if you have a kind of a regular concern about the illegitimacy and the imbalance of power within the decision making, it's going to fail. It'll fall apart and it won't exist after a certain amount of time. So building this kind of balance into the process at the very beginning, and then carrying and feeding for it over time is absolutely essential. But it's not a given.
Yeah, I think that the procedural questions are really important to note. Although I will add that we've talked a lot about the importance of process, the importance of making it thorough and making sure everybody gets a chance to have their say. the process can also grind down participation. The process can also make it less accessible and more challenging for folks that are not, for example, backed by industry or doing it on a volunteer basis, or are stretched thin, more thin than others, and are not as specialized in that space. So I do potentially see a tension there. That's not to say, you know, that you abandon the process to make it simpler, but I think that there are trade-offs to think about with that as well, insofar as, you know, accessibility can be challenging. Thomas had a follow-up. I'm not sure if, yeah, Joran, did you want to?
Yeah, I just want to say that all the questions you're saying, I think we all need to evolve. You know, there is one thing you talked about, transparency. There is actually a contradiction in transparency and swiftness and simpleness, because a lot of the process within ICANN, I can only speak for ourselves, is actually created to make sure. I mean, we are a risk-averse organization for every reason that exists in the world, because if we would actually do a mistake, it wouldn't be fun, would it? So we literally spend a lot of time talking about how many domain names can you add into a system, and how many, you know, users of the internet can it be? Would you find, oh, is that a problem? Yes, it might be. We don't know, so we have to check it. So we spend an enormous amount of time about that. But you know, we are in the process right now, internally as well, because some of the things we're doing in ICANN as an institution, we are talking a lot about, we have to balance this better because it delays the system, and you know, you to have the energy to work on something. I bet what Wendy and David says the thing. When something takes 3 or 4 years to get it done, it's like, yeah, it's a long time. I mean, we're having a project now where we're looking into add more top-level domains in many different languages around the world. So give an ability to give people not only with, you know that, you know, domain names you read from left to right in a dot somewhere. Most people in the world we have 1,600 ways to identify yourself on the internet with 5 billion users. So what we're doing right now is to figure out how to do that, so you can use your own language, your own script, your own keyboard to have a top-level domain or identifier on the internet. We have to check all the things with that. You know, can we do it? Is it possible to do it? Is it interesting to do it? So, and that's probably, it's going to take a lot of time. How do you engage with a volunteer agreement, you know, people for that period of time? There are things that we need to address with our process as well, but we can't give up the transparency of what we do, because that creates the accountability. But I just think that balancing point has to be made. With that said, we have people who have been engaged in ICANN for more than 20 years, still looking young.
Yeah. So I just, with the couple minutes that we have left on that issue of evolving, I do want to ask each of you, you know, the internet governance space is very much in flux. There's new institutions rising up. Many are still in the process of establishing or redefining their mandate. Maybe just give me like 1 minute each on your thoughts of where you see the internet governance space moving over the next decade, and how accountability and multi-stakeholderism as ideas are factoring into that. I'll start with Wendy, because I don't think she went on the last round.
Thanks. I'll try to keep it short. I think we'll see more pressure to, you know, support the one web, and we see fragmentation and pressures to divide the web, and we need to keep emphasizing the value of, you know, one interoperable web, and the technical and legal and policy environment that make that interconnection possible. And that also means that we'll keep seeing greater pressure to address some of the externalities of that, you know, communication, that we see the abuse, the misinformation, that uses these technically neutral protocols, and we see more pressure to help understand and address that. And while we don't want to become the regulators of speech, and have no plans to do that, we do have to think about how others are demanding regulation and where the technical standards and stewardship fit in. And I don't have answers, but I think that's where we'll see, pressure and evolution.
David?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that there's just a very big threat, and this was alluded to earlier, I think by Joran. There's a very big threat to multi-stakeholderism by these efforts at multilateralism, whereas multilateral approaches understood by by China and by Russia and some others. And if you hear my dog whining, he really isn't a fan of multilateralism in this space. I think that's where the big debate and potential threat to, frankly, to an open and interoperable internet might be coming, or at least that's one vector of the threat. And I think that, with the Internet Governance Forum coming up in December, I think I suspect that we'll see quite a bit more of this discussion of efforts to move the internet governance discussions at that high level into these multilateral as opposed to multi-stakeholder settings.
Joran, your final thought?
Everything they said.
All right. Great.
So
yeah, please.
I want to. So we're in the scary moment. Yes, I think there are many. First of all, multi-stakeholderism makes decision in the absence of law. If there are laws, everybody has to abide with it. And that is important to remember. We might not like it, but that's actually what it is. So to convince governments to go in and say, we should have a multi-stakeholder model, it's actually telling governments, you should now give up your ability to make law. I mean, it's actually that hard and that simple. And I think that the reasons why we're sitting in this call is because we actually started early. There was no legislation about it, and that's something we pretend. But I really want to agree with David and Bendy about the risk we're now seeing. We're seeing the political risks. Countries who wants to take over this in different shape or form. Just to think, like we just talked about the Russian proposal. We also see this in 5G. Everybody loves 5G. That our proposals in 5G that actually take away the openness of the internet itself. And that is, we call that technical internet governance. So we see them in standardization formats. Examples are new IP, has nothing to do with the internet protocol. It's just another governance model of how to transport data on the internet. So internet is not done. It's like I said, democracy is something you always have to share as and actually value and think about. The same thing as the internet. And we cannot right now, more than ever, take for granted that we will wake up tomorrow on an interoperable internet where we can actually talk to each other and do what we're doing right now. Because the fight is already here and we have to do it together. And I'm very happy for me on this call. It's been really intriguing. And next time, maybe we can meet in person, have a cup of coffee and have this discussion around the table. That would be so fun. Thank you.
Well, at least three of us are, I think, based around LA. So that might be easy. Yeah. So I want to thank you all. I just, before we go, I think that's a great place to leave it, but I just want to give a quick plug. If you're not sick of our programming yet, we do have another event on Monday in connection with the launch of the new Journal of Free Speech Law that will feature Jess Myers of Google, Eric Goldman of Santa Clara Law, and Ash Bhagwat of UC Davis. On November 17th, we have an event, again, a virtual event on transparency and corporate social responsibility with Greg Waters of SASB, Natalie Marikal of Ranking Digital Rights, and Lynn Lepucki from here at UCLA. And then on December 1st, we will have Jack Balkin, Mark Lemley, Daphne Keller, and Eugene Volok on another panel for the Journal of Free Speech Law. So I've just posted links to both of those in the chat. Thanks to everybody who connected in for our events today, which is enormously appreciated. Have a fantastic weekend, and thanks very much to our panelists.